Welcome to A World History of Christianity. We are in Chapter 2, resuming towards the bottom part of page 46. Dogma and Theology in the 4th and 5th centuries. It was a great strength in Athanasius that he combined his doctrinal battle for the faith of the Council of Nicaea with the patronage of the new monastic movement. As a friend and biographer of Antony, he had behind him a spiritual force, which could be on occasion a fairly physical one too, if the monks descended with their staffs upon the streets of Alexandria. 4th and 5th century church history is often written as if there was little else except doctrinal controversy, but the latter can only be understood within the new political and monastic framework we have hitherto been exploring. Nevertheless, the theological struggle from Nicaea in 325 to the Council of Chalcedon in 451 remains decisive for the evolution of both doctrine and the geographical shape of Christianity. Nothing mattered more to people like Basil, Ambrose, Athanasius, and their successors. In considering it, we have, however, always to remember three factors which decisively shaped it and indeed collectively ensured that every dispute would be extended to the maximum possible length in a way that was both pastorally disastrous and quite unnecessary from the viewpoint of the issues themselves. The first was that of imperial intervention, the political imposition of whatever view the current emperor favored. While this explains neither the origin of the issues disputed nor the final form any doctrine was given, it does to a large extent explain why controversies, the Arian above all, went on so long and with such devastating consequences. The second was a matter of rivalry between sees. It was inevitable that Christian thought had evolved somewhat locally in the first centuries. Alexandria, Antioch, Carthage, and Rome had all generated recognizably distinct theological traditions, though all adhered without question to the shared inheritance of the New Testament and a Eucharist-centered liturgy, whose local divergences were not very great. It was less the theological differences in themselves than the determination of leading churches to insist on getting their own doctrinal way, which ensured that the bitterness of odium theologicum would go on and on. In this, as in many a later age, theologians could be unpleasantly vituperative in what they said about each other. Thirdly, there was the ongoing problem of translating biblical ideas into the words and concepts of a Greek and Latin civilization. However, much theologians wished to base themselves on the Bible, and almost everyone at work in this period was overwhelmingly anxious to do so. It simply was not possible to write lengthy books about God, Christ, and the spiritual life without using words borrowed from philosophy, law, or poetry. It is the nature of Christianity to relate its beliefs to the culture and needs of every age, to be a translating community rather than a fundamentalist one, confined to repeating the formulas of the past. From the early 2nd century, we can see this process at work, philosophizing and argumentative. We see it above all in the writings of Origen, by far the greatest theologian of the early centuries. Great as a biblical scholar, but great too in the daring with which he made use of contemporary philosophy. It was, of course, a dangerous thing to do, and in later centuries Origen would be repeatedly blamed for fathering this error or that, but it was intrinsic to the intellectual enterprise of Christian understanding that this sort of thing was attempted. About 319, a dispute began between Alexander, Bishop of Alexandria, and one of the leading priests in the city, named Arius. It concerned the nature of Christ. There is no reason to think that either side was doing other than attempting to interpret correctly the, in places apparently contradictory, teaching of the New Testament. Arius, though little indeed of anything he wrote survives, appears to have taught that Christ was neither absolutely God, because, quote, the Father is greater than I, unquote, nor absolutely man, because he was, quote, the Word of God, unquote. He came before all the rest of creation, but was himself created. Alexander condemned this doctrine, which Arius had probably learned from his teacher, Lucian of Antioch, who had also taught Eusebius of Nicomedia. And in this he was supported by the great majority of his fellow bishops. Eusebius, sympathizing with Arius, raised the matter with Constantine when he arrived at Nicomedia, and Constantine hastily called a council to resolve the matter, just as he had done for Donatism with the Council of Arles. The council met, proved thoroughly unsympathetic to the Arius-Eusebius alliance, ratified Alexander's position, but added one word: homoousios, consubstantial, to describe the relationship of father and son. This pleased Alexander and his deacon Athanasius, but worried a great many other people who feared that it could imply a revival of Sabellianism. Sabellius was an almost unknown 3rd century theologian accused of denying any real distinction between father and son. The problem could be formulated by asking, how can one avoid subordinationism, making the son less than the father, without falling into Sabellianism, making the son one with the father? There was another problem with homoousios. It was not scriptural. Christian orthodoxy was here being defined in terms of a Greek philosophical word, ousia, or essence, which everyone did not understand in the same way. Theologians had already used many such terms in their writings, but the idea that biblical revelation actually required for its exact interpretation the use of a non-biblical term in a dogmatic statement was hard for many thoroughly orthodox traditionalists to accept. It certainly constituted a considerable leap towards the development of doctrine, but the final, almost universal acceptance of the Nicene Creed proved paradigmatic for Christian orthodoxy ever after. Its formulation would go beyond that of the Bible. Throughout the whole series of controversies from the early 4th to the late 5th century, a contrast remains between a typical Alexandrian approach and a typical Antiochian one. The Alexandrians stressed the divinity of Christ, veering at times toward Sabellian-like phraseology, while the Antiochians insisted on his humanity in a way that might on occasion suggest undermining anything more than a moral relationship between him and the Father. So while people in the Antiochian tradition, such as Eusebius of Caesarea, were unhappy with the homoousios, they were no less opposed to the doctrine of Arius because it appeared to undermine Christ's true humanity as much as his divinity. Over the next half-century, the Eastern emperors, in particular Constantius, 337 to 360, and Valens, 364 to 378, consistently backed the Arian party, following in this a line Eusebius of Nicomedia had established in Constantinople, while the Western emperors, Constans, 337 to 351, Valentinian, 364 to 375, and Gratian, 375 to 383, were almost equally consistent in support of Nicene orthodoxy. The reason for that was that the less theologically minded Latin Church had no problem with Nicaea and was already very firmly committed to the divinity of Christ. The worst years for Nicene orthodoxy were between 351 and 360, when Constantius was sole emperor and endeavored to impose a sort of simplified Arianism upon the whole church. On the theological front, Athanasius, for much of the time in exile in the West or in hiding with monastic friends in Egypt, was staking out the Nicene position by his most famous work, On the Incarnation, and a series of later treatises. But what in the end mattered most was the viewpoint of the Eastern or Antiochene bishops, whose Trinitarian orthodoxy was in reality unimpeachable, but who were deeply unhappy with Nicene and Alexandrian terminology and have come in consequence to be termed Semi-Arians. In due course, after the death of Constantius, and with Athanasius growing less pugnacious and more conciliatory in old age, the upholders of Nicaea and the Easterners came together, helped particularly by St. Basil, to recognize that it had been terminology, not belief, that divided them. But it was only after the death of almost all the main protagonists that peace was fully established, with the Council of Constantinople of 381, made possible by the accession as emperor in 379 of Theodosius, whose background was Western and who, unlike his predecessor Valens, had no doubt that the Council of Nicaea was to be adhered to. At that point, the whole thing simply came to an end with one major exception, and it would have done so much earlier if emperors in Constantinople had not consistently thwarted the Church's own mechanisms for finding agreement. The one exception, however, mattered a great deal. About 341, Eusebius of Nicomedia, by then Bishop of Constantinople, had consecrated a young man named Ulfilas as Bishop of the Goths. He spent the next 50 years evangelizing them both outside and within the empire, and he translated the Bible into Gothic, a remarkable achievement for a proto-missionary. But the doctrine he had learnt from Eusebius was straight Arianism, and in consequence, both the Goths and related peoples, like the Vandals, adopted Christianity in an Arian form. The result of this for Western Europe in the 5th and 6th centuries, when most of Gaul, Italy, Spain, and North Africa had been conquered by Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, or Burgundians, was enormous. The trail left behind him by Eusebius of Nicomedia proved a very long one. Nearly 50 years after the Council of Constantinople, a new wave of theological controversy suddenly engulfed the Eastern Church, a natural sequel to the earlier one. In 428, the Emperor Theodosius II appointed Nestorius, a monk from Antioch, to be Patriarch of Constantinople. Nestorius was a friend and confidant of Bishop John of Antioch. Zealous to put things to right in his diocese, but wholly inexperienced as to how to do so, he found Constantinople, as did many another bishop, a veritable wasp's nest. He was not a great theologian, but someone pedantically anxious to put across the Antiochene line in Christology, which stressed the full reality of Jesus' humanity. Hence he objected to the title Theotokos, Mother of God, as applied to Mary, because it seemed to imply that she was Christ's mother according to his Godhead, not his manhood. Yet it had been around for a couple of hundred years, though its usage had much increased of late and was greatly favored by Pulcheria, the extremely devout and influential elder sister of the somewhat weak-minded Theodosius II. While some who objected to the title of Theotokos would only allow her to be called Anthropokotos, Mother of the Man, Nestorius insisted that the right word must be Christotokos, Mother of Christ. The reaction was immediate on the part of numerous monks within the capital who heckled him in his sermons and sought the protection of Pulcheria. How could the Bishop of Alexandria not intervene in this heaven-sent opportunity to defend the divinity of Christ while humiliating the bishop of Constantinople and the Antiochene theological tradition at the same time, to insist that Mary was not Theotokos, but only the mother of Christ, seemed clearly to impugn Christ's divinity, or even to suggest the old heresy of two sons, one divine, one human, linked only morally. Cyril of Alexandria, as productive and brilliant a writer of theology as Athanasius, had been its bishop since 412, when he succeeded his uncle Theophilus. His pugnacity was equal to that of any of his predecessors. Theophilus had successfully engineered the deposition of St. John Chrysostom from the see of Constantinople in 403. Chrysostom had unwisely incurred the hostility of the Empress Eudoxia through the tactlessness of his preaching, and it was singularly unwise of Nestorius to lay himself open so soon after appointment to a similar attack. But Cyril was not alone in condemnation. While the Bishop of Rome in 403 had unsuccessfully spoken up for Chrysostom against his enemies, Pope Celestine in 430 had no doubt that Nestorius had fallen into error and formally condemned him in an Italian synod held that summer. Meanwhile, the bishops of the provinces of Antioch, Nestorius's home area, were offering him only rather lukewarm support. Cyril now issued a public condemnation, which was delivered in December at Constantinople, requiring Nestorius's retraction within 10 days. In no time at all, an inexperienced archbishop's attempts to suppress what he regarded as a misleading development in Marian devotion had escalated into an empire-wide ecclesiastical crisis. Theodosius, who had for a while sympathized with Nestorius, whom he had himself chosen hardly 2 years earlier, now called a council to resolve the dispute, and perhaps, at Pulcheria's suggestion, ordered it to meet at Ephesus, where Marian devotion was particularly strong. In June 431, Cyril and the Egyptian bishops arrived there before the Antiochenes, who might have sympathized with Nestorius. Refusing to wait for them, or for the papal legate, and backed by Memnon of Ephesus, he condemned Nestorius while affirming the doctrine of the Theotokos. When John of Antioch and the Syrians arrived, they held a rival council and condemned Cyril, but their numbers were only 34, while almost 200 bishops supported Cyril, as did the papal delegates when they arrived. For a time, a confused emperor and his officials actually put Cyril, Memnon, and Nestorius alike under arrest, but soon came down on the side of the majority. Nestorius alone was deposed, while Antioch and Alexandria were eventually reconciled largely through the good offices of bishops of Rome, Celestine, and then Sixtus III, who, while backing the decisions taken at Ephesus, refused to regard John of Antioch as excommunicated. Such is the somewhat absurd story of the Third Ecumenical Council. The intensity of the conflict derived from the foolishness of Nestorius, the passions engendered both in monasteries and among the common people by Marian devotion, and the aggressiveness of Cyril. But the underlying tension between theological traditions was in no way resolved, and the very success of Cyril at Ephesus paved the way for the next, still more disastrous round of conflict. It all began at Constantinople in 448 and centered around Eutyches, an aged monk in the city, archimandrite of a community of 300, and a fervent upholder of Alexandrian teaching. By then, the bishop of Constantinople was named Flavian, while in Alexandria, Cyril had died in 444 and been succeeded by his archdeacon Dioscorus. Eutyches was condemned by a local Constantinopolitan synod for denying that Christ had a human nature, but that was just what the Alexandrian tradition had also come to deny. Its huge stress on the divinity allowed little room for any formulation which safeguarded a distinct humanity. At an extraordinary council held once more in Ephesus in August 449, Dioscorus dominated the proceedings, denounced Flavian together with his supporter Domnus of Antioch, and had them both deposed. The representatives of Pope Leo had brought with them his tomos, backing Flavian and setting forth a doctrine of one person but two natures, were insulted and ignored. Flavian was so ill-treated that he rapidly died. The Emperor Theodosius accepted what had happened, and it looked like just one more victory for the power of Alexandria. But within a few months, Theodosius died from a fall from his horse. And Pulcheria became empress, choosing as her consort an elderly general named Marcian. For Pulcheria, Leo's word was decisive. Moreover, she had admired Flavian, and his body was brought back for solemn burial. In 451, a new council was summoned and met in Chalcedon, a suburb of Constantinople, in October. Dioscorus arrived, arrogant as ever, and promptly excommunicated Leo. This was too much. The acts of the 449 Council at Ephesus, now called the Robber Council, a phrase of Leo's, were annulled and Dioscorus deposed. Still more important, a new definition of faith affirmed Christ to be one person in two natures which are united unconfusedly, unchangeably, indivisibly, inseparably. A definition based partly on Cyril and partly on Leo's tone. While the council insisted that it was moving in no way from the doctrine of Cyril, it was in reality slightly shifting its terminology back towards the Antiochene. The dominance of Alexandria ended at that moment, but effectively so did communion between the greater part of Egyptian Christianity and the Roman Constantinopolitan alliance. The tension which had for long been building up between a Constantinople-centered Greek empire and Coptic society broke out in ecclesiastical schism, and when a new Chalcedonian bishop was appointed for Alexandria, he was rapidly lynched. The Coptic Church insisted that the in two natures formula of Chalcedon was a betrayal of its own theological tradition and indeed the unity of Christ. From then on, it could be described as monophysite. When one considers the doctrinal history expressed in the early ecumenical councils as a whole, one may well conclude that it demonstrates the disaster of pursuing something called orthodoxy. In his first years as Bishop of Alexandria, Cyril spent much of his time refuting Sabellians, Arians, Novatianists, Adoptionists, Manichaeans, and dispossessing them of their churches, while at the same time harrying the Jewish and pagan communities. He was not unusual in so behaving. Indeed, imperial order almost required it, although the urban prefect found the bishop's interference in matters of civil order intolerable. The Christian church by the 5th century appears, especially in the East, as exaggeratedly preoccupied with doctrinal correctness. The cult of the concept of orthodoxy proved inherently self-destructive, but it is not surprising that in the end this became the very word by which the Greek church and its offspring are described. It is ironic that a generation after Cyril, those most loyal to his teaching were themselves excluded from the communion of the Orthodox. His formula, one nature of God, the Son incarnate, did not quite tally with Chalcedon's in two natures, and the Church of the Eastern Mediterranean never recovered from the resultant dislocation. In retrospect, it is highly questionable how much real difference in Christological belief there was between the varied formulas canvassed at the time, all making use of a range of Greek philosophical terms referring to person, nature, and substance, hypostasis, physis, prosopon, ousia, whose exact meaning there was no way of defining. One may well hold that the Chalcedonian formula did something to prevent effective denial of Jesus' real humanity in a way that the Alexandrian formulas did not, and one may also judge that the Antiochene tradition was less intolerant than the Alexandrian. The authority of the See of Antioch itself over neighboring cities was less great, while there is more sense of a diffused theology whose proponents were to be found in many different places, while in Alexandria, theological correctness had come to be closely identified with the person of the bishop, Athanasius, and then Cyril. It was also the sheer personal aggressiveness of 3 bishops of Alexandria in a row, Theophilus, Cyril, and Dioscorus, which finally led to a debacle as disastrous for the leadership of Alexandria as for the Greek church as a whole. Behind the ecclesiastical struggle, one may, however, also discern a wider social divergence, a sense of alienation in Egypt and elsewhere, with the evolving character of the empire in what we may call a Byzantine direction. Up to the end of the 4th century, the emperors, even though Constantinople was now the capital, remained extremely peripatetic. Theodosius I, like Constantine, was still essentially a Roman emperor, who might actually be found almost anywhere. But as the 5th century progressed, this notably changed. The emperors remained in Constantinople, while the more remote provinces, particularly a wealthy and powerful province like Egypt, with its own historic traditions and written language, felt excluded from the inner circle of power. Alexandrian ecclesiastical aggressiveness was in part at least reaction to that sense of exclusion, but it precipitated an even greater exclusion which undermined the empire, preparing the ground for its collapse under Arab attack in the 7th century. Despite various attempts at reconciliation, particularly by the emperors Zeno, 474 to 491, and Anastasius, 491 to 518, assisted by Acacius, the Patriarch of Constantinople, nothing lasting was achievable. Every attempt to placate Alexandria meant a retreat from Chalcedon, unacceptable in Rome, and while Roman authority was seldom evaluated in Constantinople in fully Roman terms, it was never happily disregarded for long. Meanwhile, Chalcedon itself helped ensure that the primacy of Constantinople, as asserted in the Council of 381, but hitherto ineffectual, now became a reality. It did so by effectively undermining its principal practical rival, the Church of Alexandria, and by reasserting and extending what the earlier council had decreed. The Bishop of New Rome was now assigned equal honors to the Bishop of Old Rome. The Roman legates inevitably protested, but in terms of ecclesiastical history, Chalcedon, by its precise definition of Christological orthodoxy, its insistence upon the authority of Constantinople as equal to that of Rome, and its undermining of the Church of Alexandria, established the norms and boundaries of Byzantine Christianity with a decisiveness which would endure ever after. The situation in the West was far less clear. It is striking how small a part anyone from the West played in the ecumenical councils we have discussed. Almost no one other than representatives of the Pope. One could even ask whether they were ecumenical at all. By the time of Chalcedon, most of the West had been lost to imperial rule, but Rome and central Italy still remained part of the empire, and Rome's representation was important to the emperor for that very reason. The more he lost military control over the Latin world, the more valuable it was to retain a hold on Rome and to even encourage its bishops to extend their working jurisdiction over Gaul, Spain, and elsewhere, which had, as he hoped but temporarily, slipped from his control. Rome remained then a bridge between Latin and Greek worlds, but for the time, the former was in too great confusion to fuss greatly over the doctrinal leadership of the latter. Latins were anyway less philosophically minded than Greeks. Rome itself had produced no Christian theologians of any distinction, while the Church of Carthage, the only one in the West to do so, was quite torn apart by Donatism. Papal preoccupations were always more with jurisdiction than theology, while Latin theological interests, such as they were, seemed to take a more down-to-earth direction, centered on the moral life, the nature of grace, the sacraments, and the church, rather than on the mysteries of the Godhead. By far the most serious doctrinal controversy in the West, apart from the Donatist conflict confined to Africa, was that surrounding the teaching of Pelagius and his followers about grace, original sin, and the moral life. What is striking is how low-key the ecclesiastical response to it actually was, apart from Augustine's fierce rejoinders. Only in Carthage, under his influence, was there a council of any size to condemn Pelagianism, while the so-called semi-Pelagianism of Cassian and other spiritual writers in Gaul escaped unjudged until the 6th century. If the West was, nonetheless, to be for generations plagued by schism, it was due to the importation by Germanic tribes from the Balkans of the Arianism of the East. Only with the conversion to Catholicism of Clovis, king of the Franks, circa 496, and of Recared, king of the Visigoths in Spain almost a century later, would this be effectively overcome. The Catholic Arian schism was nevertheless simply an extension of the wider civil crisis, the collapse of imperial rule, the sacking of cities, the general social devastation brought about by Germanic migration. The course of Western Church history in this period following so soon on the apparent golden age of Christian Latin society, as seen in the career of Ambrose, may best be approached through the life of the man about whom we know far more than anyone else in the ancient world, Augustine of Hippo. This is the case because while Augustine was an intellectual giant, far transcending anyone else of his period, his career remained in many ways typical of his generation. Through him we can see the transformation of both society and church. Augustine was born in 354 in Thagaste, a small Roman inland town in Numidia, part of modern Algeria. His mother was a Christian, his father was not. He was baptized, but imbibed a kind of Christian culture which, until he was over 30, he could neither completely identify with nor definitively reject. They were far from wealthy, but fortunate in being somehow connected to a wealthy local landowner, Romanianus, who took care of Augustine's education and ensured that he went to the university in Carthage, where he studied and taught until in 383 he moved to teach rhetoric in Rome. Throughout his years in Carthage, he was caught up in Manichaeism, dualist, semi-Christian, the fashionable form of the religious approach which 2 centuries earlier we described as Gnostic. It seemed more intellectually respectable than either Orthodox Catholicism or its local schismatic variation, Donatism. What is quite clear is that the academic atmosphere of Carthage and Rome was still essentially traditional. It was hard to meet an Orthodox Christian who was also a thoroughly educated man. In due course, he decided that Manichaean doctrine, while claiming a sort of scientific foundation, was actually rubbish. He was helped to this conclusion not through any sort of Christian theology, but by reading some Platonist literature, probably Plotinus, translated into Latin by Marius Victorinus, a distinguished Roman scholar who in old age had become a Christian. It was only after Augustine moved to Milan as professor of rhetoric in the autumn of 384 that he even learnt that Victorinus had done so. It was clearly something of a revelation that anyone so intelligent could accept Orthodox Christianity. But in Milan, everything seemed different. On one side, Augustine had reached the geographical center of the Western Empire, its imperial capital, and could even hope to move from his academic chair to a provincial governorship. On another, he was in a city intellectually dominated by Ambrose. The central crisis in Augustine's life took place in the next couple of years. The lower-class mistress, with whom he had lived happily for years, was sent away, so that he could prepare to marry an upper-class girl, a suitable wife for a successful political figure. But a deeper crisis swept all that aside. Augustine read Paul's letters, listened to Ambrose's sermons, discussed the most basic philosophical and religious issues with a group of friends, and decided to be baptized. But baptism at the hands of Ambrose at Easter 387 meant beginning a wholly new life. For Augustine and his friends, it meant an end to an academic career, political ambitions, or even marriage. Augustine and his closest friend, Alphaeus, returned to Africa and founded a monastery back home at Thagaste. It was, however, hard to imagine that a man as distinguished as Augustine would be left to live a monastic life. If one dominant movement within 4th century Christianity was out of the world and into a monastery, another movement no less decisive for the reshaping of the church was out of the monastery and into an episcopal chair. The first step was ordination to the priesthood. The Bishop of Hippo, a coastal town some 50 miles north of Thagaste, took advantage of Augustine's presence in the congregation to preach on the need for new blood in the ministry, especially in the circumstances of the somewhat demoralized local Catholic community. Under pressure from both Donatists and Manichees, Augustine was effectively kidnapped into the priesthood and then compelled to preach by his far-sighted bishop, despite the rule that only bishops should do so. When Bishop Valerius died in 395, Augustine was his inevitable successor. He established a monastery beside his cathedral so that he could be at once both bishop and monk, and of course writer as well. Books had been pouring forth already, and they would continue to do so for the next 35 years of his episcopate. Alypius, meanwhile, became Bishop of Thagaste. Outwardly, Augustine's life from the moment that he arrived in Hippo was quiet enough. He never left Africa again and seldom traveled further than Carthage. He engaged in the theological controversy apparently inseparable from the work of a bishop, arguing with the Manichees, Donatists, and Pelagians. He wrote the Confessions, the story of his own conversion, one of the few books of antiquity which is absolutely readable today. He became increasingly an establishment figure, relying on imperial authority to suppress Donatism. He had moved from a world where Christianity still appeared marginal to one where it was entirely central, and yet he saw all that fall to pieces too. In 410, the Goths under Alaric sacked Rome. The legions were withdrawn from Britain at the same time. Gaul, and Spain were overrun by Germanic tribes. The really great work of Augustine's later years, prompted by the sack of Rome, was the writing of the 22 books of the City of God. Here, bypassing the sort of providential idealization of the Roman Empire, which Eusebius of Caesarea had developed to explain the triumph of Constantine, and which remained ever after the core philosophy of the Byzantine Empire, Augustine worked out a vast and somber philosophy of history in which empires rise and fall, essentially unlinked to a divine city manifest, in, though not identical with, the Catholic Church. It was an interpretation desperately needed at a time when Christians could naturally be accused of having brought about the fall of Rome. Had not they, after all, suppressed the altar of victory in the Senate House? Nor was this only relevant to some temporary upset in Rome. In 429, the Vandals invaded North Africa. As Augustine lay dying in August 430, their fleet stood outside the harbor of Hippo. Hardly was he dead than it too fell and was devastated, though, amazingly, his disciples smuggled his entire library to safety, so that we still possess almost everything which Augustine wrote. Augustine was sui generis a theologian, philosopher, preacher, and letter writer whose work wholly eclipses that of anyone and everyone else writing in Latin in his age. Apart from Augustine, the theologians of the Latin West were very pedestrian in comparison with the Greeks, but there is no Greek theologian of the period whose work is really comparable in range, precision, and a consistent depth of interrogation of both biblical teaching and human experience. He knew little Greek, so that his own work was not greatly affected by that of his Eastern contemporaries, nor were his writings much known in the East. Theologically, this was the point of separation. Ever after, Augustine would be the schoolmaster of the West. Through not only the Dark Ages, already beginning when he died, but also the High Middle Ages and the Reformation. Everyone would appeal to Augustine and would be profoundly affected by his gloomy view of fallen nature, his absolute insistence on the necessity of grace, but also on an extraordinarily rich spectrum of ideas about God, love, the Church, and history. The East would know nothing of this. It would be spared Augustine's pessimism, but it would also lack his disciplined precision and a certain skepticism about any and every political achievement. Its range of theological resources would remain, nevertheless, richer and more diversified than that of the Latin world. If one considers the 60 years between the year 370, in which Ambrose became a bishop in the West and Basil in the East, and 430, when Augustine died, they include by far the greater part of the most creative and enduring writing which we associate with the high patristic age. In the East, these years embrace almost all the work of Basil, Gregory of Nyssa, Gregory of Nazianzus, John Chrysostom, Cyril of Jerusalem, and Cyril of Alexandria. In Latin, the writings of Ambrose, Jerome, Augustine, and Cassian. There were many lesser figures, but the sheer wealth of theological thought and spiritual insight to be found in those 10 names in particular would be hard to rival in any other period of Christian history. Doubtless it could not go on, and the ease with which theological creativity turned into self-destructive heresy hunt is all too obvious. It was nevertheless a moment of genius. Many of this group, Basil, the two Gregories, Chrysostom, and Augustine above all, had been deeply educated in the traditional learning of Athens and Rome before turning to theology. That may have had something to do with the freshness of their thought, a sense of diverse stimulation possible only for those inhabiting a philosophical frontier. Several of them, too, had quite checkered careers in other ways as well. Where they became monks, it was out of an entirely adult decision. The tension in many of their lives between ecclesiastical service in the episcopate or otherwise, and the call to contemplative prayer remains evident. The circumstances of this still rather open age would pass as a Christianized political order and established monastic institutions created in the East a more religiously and intellectual predictable world, while in the West the collapse of town life and imperial rule would not encourage the kind of career which was possible for Augustine. With the passing of this generation and the sealing of theological speculation at Chalcedon, the shape of theology would change very little until the emergence in the West of scholasticism in the 12th and 13th centuries.